My name is Greg Ryder. I'm the president of the Circumnavigators Club Foundation, and I've held that position for nearly 20 years, a little more than 20 years, over two different tranches. I went to Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, did my circumnavigation in 1971. My research topic was the image of America, the psychological impact of American foreign policy. And the rest of it really was on the man in the street. But that was too long for the title. It was too long already, so we shortened it. My grant was actually the first grant that Circumnavigators Club Foundation had done. It wasn't done on a chapter basis. It was done on a club-wide basis, and it was run both the selection and the management of the grant itself by the senior officers of the Circumnavigators Foundation and Club based in New York City. I went to England, West Germany, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan. There was a notice posted on a bulletin board near the great big globe that was near the dean's office in the lobby of the Walsh Building in the East Campus, which used to be the home of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. When I read that paragraph that said, propose a study trip that's going to take you around the world to countries of your choosing during the summer between your junior and senior years, to tell you the truth, I pinched myself. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. It just fit me to a T. I had traveled abroad to the Far East when I was in high school with a student group. I had subscribed to Foreign Affairs magazine when I was 14 years old. I had a great interest in foreign affairs, which is why I went to the Foreign Service School. And I couldn't think of anything that would be more interesting than undertaking this grant. I did a lot of thinking, and I knew that the competition for this grant was going to be fairly intense and was going to include some of the best and the brightest from the Foreign Service School for my class. It hadn't been done before. There was nobody to talk to about it. It was a totally new effort. It was sponsored by the dean's office of the school, but the dean himself really didn't know much about it because there'd never been one before. I was a guinea pig. So I said to myself, what can I do to set myself apart from people that I knew were, for the most part, were going to pick very technical and fairly narrow areas of study. They did a little research on the Circumnavigators Club, and I thought to myself, what is it that's going to interest a bunch of people whose sole interest of being together in camaraderie and clubship is that their desire to travel and their desire to talk about traveling with their fellow club members. So I tried to pick a topic that was both broad and would have general appeal to the Circumnavigators Club themselves, yet was timely. I looked around and saw what was happening in the streets of Washington, D.C. with the tremendous anti-war protests. I read the headlines from foreign newspapers roundly condemning the United States for everything from the Vietnam War to our cultural hegemony. And I said to myself, there must be more to the story around the world about what people think about the United States than what I'm reading in these headlines. And I'm going to try to dig beneath that veneer and find out. And that was the genesis of my project. You know what, I've done a lot of applying over the years, and I had up to that point, but this one called for research on a global scale. And in the pre-internet days, that was a bit of a daunting task. It meant a lot more time spent in the library, but it was only incremental since I was there about 6 to 7 hours a day anyway. And I had to do a lot of boning up on the countries I intended to visit, and that meant going through books, not clicking on the internet. So it took time. I picked the countries that I chose because they represented a cross-section of the world, at least the Northern Hemisphere, which is all that my around the world flight ticket would allow me to visit. And all of them had played varying degrees of roles in the history of the mid-20th century. Some had been our allies, some had been our adversaries, some had been caught in between. Some I just wanted to visit. Plus, there were places that were sufficiently, some of them off the beaten path, that I might not get back to them again. So in each country, I made a concerted effort beforehand and once I got to the country to interview and talk to as broad a representation of people as I could. And by broad as representation, I mean as a man on the street and a man all inclusive of mankind as possible. That included business people, shopkeepers, students, bus drivers, bureaucrats, teachers, journalists, active and retired military people, hotel keepers, and many others. So those are the people I went to produce my research. I was awarded this grant in April, and I was due to leave, according to my itinerary, on the 1st of June. That left very, very little time to get everything in order that I need to do. The most pressing matter of which was obtaining visas, particularly for the Eastern European countries. And back then, you couldn't get visas through the mail. You couldn't get them online. You had to physically present or mail in your passport to a consulate or an embassy and have them process the visa. And the amount of time it took to do that varied from country to country. So there was this great big jigsaw puzzle in front of me for the 8 or 10 visas that I need to obtain with about a month to do it, to put all of them in place about where was I going to drop my passport off first in order to get that visa within that period of time, and another visa another period of time. Fortunately, I had a girlfriend who had a car that helped in the effort. Unfortunately, I was living in Washington, D.C., where I could just drive to the embassy. It would have been impossible to do otherwise. In the end, I dropped Russia from the Soviet Union from my itinerary because they wanted 4 weeks to process the visa, and I just didn't have it. That was the biggest challenge. The second thing was trying to contact potential people that I wanted to interview when I was en route. And that meant really, identifying them across the broad spectrum of society, B, sending letters to them, trying to find out where to send the letters, C, getting responses back, and D, incorporating them into my itinerary where I could. Well, the UK was a practical stop, really. I didn't want to conduct research in some of the Western European countries that were well on the radar of people back home. So, but I needed to stop in the UK because the treasurer of the foundation, a man named Cortland Linder, and a wonderful fellow and one of the founders of the foundation, had an office there and spent a lot of time there. And he actually had to co-sign the back of the check that I was to get my spending money for the trip, the $1,000 of the $2,500. That's the airline ticket that I needed to keep me going for the rest of my trip. So I met with him in his office. He signed the check. I took it down to American Express and got funds. The interesting thing about Cortland, he was a very sagacious guy, as everybody who knows him will recall. And he gave me some good advice, and it was advice that sort of paired with what I was trying to do with my trip. And he told me not to expect to be considered anything special because I was an American when I was abroad. He said there was very little about the United States, particularly in the UK papers. There was very little at that time in the European press. Of course, there was a lot about the war and about the Cold War, the war in Afghanistan and the Cold War more broadly. But it wasn't like it was back home, where being an American abroad was something important and well reported in the press. So that was good advice. It fit nicely with my project. So I stopped there, took a couple of trips outside of London, a place I'd always wanted to go to ever since I watched Peter Pan when I was a young boy, flying over those chimneys and over the rooftops, and I saw some chimneys. And then I took off for West Germany, took off for Frankfurt. Well, like in a lot of countries, the Philippines, Japan, other places where there were standing US troops on the ground, there was a love-hate relationship. On the one hand, because 25 years after we had expelled the specter of the Nazis from Europe, that had been replaced by the specter of the Soviet Union. And what had once been an evenly divided city of Berlin to forestall the advance of the Nazis became a game between the Allies and against the onslaught of the Russian aggression. So the Germans, on the one hand, they weren't allowed to rearm for a good long time after the war, and they really needed foreign troops on their soil to forestall the advances that the Soviets had made as far as to East Germany, and no doubt would have pressed on westward had we allowed him. So I think there is a lot of gratitude on the part of the German people for the rebuilding effort we had done after the war. There was a lot of feeling ashamed by the Germans for the actions of the Nazis. They were sorry, as were we, that they had to take the brunt of those actions. But they were very happy for the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe. And so there was a deep sense of gratitude, both in East Germany and in West Germany, for what America had done. And the presence of American troops on an ongoing basis in Berlin and other bases in Germany, near Frankfurt and other places, on a broad brush stroke was viewed positively, but as everything else, the devil's in the details. And if your daughter was being wooed by American soldiers and you didn't like that, then of course, you could go home. But I went on a bus on my way from a travel bureau in West Berlin. I didn't go individually through. You had to get with a group in order to go into East Germany at that time, or at least I did. And so I went through with, after getting a visa on the ground there at the East German Travel Bureau, got passage through to East Germany. And I'll tell you, the contrast between West and East Germany was very, very stark indeed. It was a dismal place in so many ways, and people were suffering, and it wasn't a fun place to be a tourist. And I didn't spend long there. Poland, of course, has always been a pond between the monsters to the east and the west of it, Russia and Germany, and throughout its whole history. So it was a very fascinating place, and I wanted to see it, and I wanted to see it for a long time. Fortunately, when I got there, I say fortunately, I wasn't able to get a hotel room because the hotel I wanted to go to was booked. But the desk clerk at the hotel, after seeing me waiting in the lobby for about 4 hours for him to find a vacancy or somebody who was a no-show, finally came over to me, realized I wasn't going to bribe him for a room, and told me he would call a friend of his who could help me. And lo and behold, shortly up drives in a little teeny Russian car, a perky 30-something red-haired Polish lady who spoke pretty good English, and she whisked me off to the apartment that she shared with her husband, who was really a dour sort of guy who gave me sidelong glances. I think he was either a university professor or a bureaucrat of some sort, but he wasn't engaged in any conversation with me. He didn't speak English. And her two sons, both of whom were university students. One of them was a medical student. And she proceeded to spend the next several days driving me she wanted me to see everything there was to see in Warsaw. And she did a pretty good job of it. She was very, very intent on my seeing the parliament, for example. So she double parked or parked illegally in front of the parliament building and whisked up the steps and pushed her way past the guard who was trying to detain us from entering, and we had a look at the empty chamber. And she was also very proud of her university and intent upon me seeing a lecture hall at the university. It happened that it was exam time at the university, so the lecture halls were closed off to visitors. But that didn't stop her. She pushed past up one of them, and we barged into a final exam for the medical faculty, and the students were absolutely enraged. But there you have it. She was just a very, very, very unique person. She loved the West. She liked Americans. She loved the chance to practice English. She never told me what she was going to charge me for all of this door-to-door service. She did drive me to the airport at the end, but when we got at the airport, I sort of said, "What do I owe you for the last 3 nights lodging and continuous tour guiding?" And she said, "Whatever you feel like paying or can afford to pay me." So I think I gave her $25 or something like that, which she was delighted with. It was over my budget, I know, but probably well under her expectation, but she was gracious about it. And we remained friends for a long time. We exchanged letters and Christmas cards for many, many years. I wonder whatever happened to her. The second thing that happened in Poland was that on one of the afternoons when she wasn't available to drive me around, I took a guided tour. And we stopped at a museum. It was on a small tour bus, and it was a full tour bus. And then we disembarked from the bus as is customary. The driver said, "It's okay to leave your belongings on the bus. I'll be here to watch them. Nobody will bother them." So I didn't think anything about it, and I left a bag on the bus, and it had some rolls of film, and it had my notes, my trip notes from the trip thus far. Well, when I got back to the bus, I noticed that the bag was missing from the seat, as was the seatmate who had been there when we got off the bus, and who had been there for the earlier part of the tour. And I got to thinking, why would somebody steal my bag? There was nothing in it but exposed rolls of film and a secretary's notebook with a spiral ring on top. And then it dawned on me that I'd left the ballpoint pen and that spiral ring on top of the notebook that I used to take notes. And it was a black pen, and it had blazoned on the side of it, "Property of the US government." This was a pen that I borrowed from a post office back home. And I guess it was enough to make the fellow in the seat next to me, who may well have been somebody sent to watch over on behalf of the security apparatus, travelers anyway, must have been enough for him to think that I was some sort of a spy. So he grabbed it and took off. They didn't come back for me, so I guess I was clean and happy to get away with only having lost my post office pen and my notes and my film. To Hungary, I put Hungary and Bulgaria and Romania on my itinerary sort of at the last minute, once I found out that I couldn't go to the Soviet Union, and I put them on there as sort of proxies for the Soviet Union, because the heavy hand of the USSR was present there. It was present in East Germany. It was present in Hungary, or in Poland as well, but more so in the smaller countries in the Balkans, and so or near the Balkans, and so I did want to add them in, and Hungary, it was a very interesting place, kind of downtrodden at that point. Only 10 years earlier, 9 years earlier, the Soviets had whacked them down big time after they tried an uprising against them. So people were very cautious in the presence of foreigners, and especially Americans, and I had a difficult time finding people I could talk to other than true men in the street. I couldn't talk to journalists, for example. I couldn't find any educators to talk to, but I did enjoy a good goulash meal in a small restaurant with two very pretty young Hungarian girls at the table next to me, one of whom asked me if my hair was real. It was pretty long at the time. I laughed and told her it was. And later, I think it was later that same night, I got chased down the street by the proprietor and a saxophonist from a small nightclub who thought I'd stiffed them out of the bill, but I'd actually left the money on the table, which I guess was a no-no, because they feared theft by their own employees, and I didn't pay at the desk going out, but we got it sorted out, and I made it out of Hungary in good shape. I'll tell you, it was a dream come true for me, because I had taken as an elective course a wonderful art history and architecture course the semester before at Georgetown. It was one of my electives for the program. And the Englishman who taught the course was absolutely brought to life all the monuments of antiquity. And I've studied in great detail the Parthenon and the surrounding buildings on the Acropolis. So when I got there, for me, it was just like reliving what I just learned and looking at the friezes and looking at all the various elements of the buildings. And there weren't at that time any scaffolds around the Parthenon, so it was quite visible. Here's a picture of me standing in front on the steps of the Parthenon, 1971, and with no obstruction. And it was a delight, I can tell you. The whole city was a delight. I stayed with an English woman who was married to a Greek guy in their apartment. They had a terrace on the back of it, a small terrace overlooking the backside of the Acropolis itself. So it was easy for me to walk around and see everything. And as you know, as I'm sure you do know in Athens, you really can't walk to about everywhere. You have to even climb up that massively tall hill, but the views are wonderful. The people are hospitable. Again, a Balkan city that's been a puppet between, a pawn between East and West for in north and south when the Ottomans were afoot for its history, but a lovely and hospitable population. Turkey Istanbul is a place I'd always wanted to visit, and I was so happy to be there and see close up so much of what I've studied and read about my whole life, particularly going back into antiquity. And yeah, it was all of those things and more. I enjoyed it. The only thing that went amiss, I went up to the Black Sea, went up the Bosporus, and spent the day on a beach in the Black Sea, and had a chance to talk to a lot of the weekenders who go up there and spend the weekend up on the Black Sea, the Turkish people, as well as tourists from other countries. But the city itself, I've been back many times, and there's nothing quite as breathtaking as that first time, I can assure you. The only thing there, I did learn a good lesson in Turkey, and that's not to be quite as trusting as I was. I left something, and the lesson also is sometimes things that don't seem very important to us have a tremendous amount of value to people who don't have as much as we do. And I had left a small, wonderful 12-day wine Baby Ben travel alarm clock in a leather case sitting on the bed the nightstand by my bed in the hotel, and came back to find it missing. And I didn't have an alarm clock for the rest of the trip, which was inconvenient at times. But don't always assume that people are just going to go for your nowadays your sneakers or blue jeans or your watch. There are a lot of things that they want, so take care. Lebanon was sort of an R&R stop for me. Not really, it wasn't intended to be, but I ran into a group of R&R UN peacekeeping mission soldiers who were on a mission in Africa, and they were spending R&R in Beirut. And one of them was a Dutch guy by the name of Geert. I can't remember his last name. Wonderful fellow, but very knowledgeable. And he proceeded to spend the next he knew Beirut like the back of his hand, because they spent so much of their leave there. And he took me on the Cook's tour of Beirut for sure, from the nightclubs to the American University of Beirut. And he was very, very hospitable, and he introduced me to a friend of his who was also vacationing there, who happened to have been a colonel in the Egyptian army. And that was interesting for me to get a different perspective on Middle Eastern politics from him as well. But we had a lot of fun together. We had a lot of interesting times together. And I was really sorry to leave Beirut, but it was only meant to be a stopover, really, on my way to Israel. First, I'll just back up a second. When I got to the country, my first stop was going to be a kibbutz down in what's now the Gaza Strip. It was a Gaza Strip then also. And my roommate from college of the year before was spending the summer working on a kibbutz, as a lot of young American Jews did back in those days. The kibbutzes now are kind of kaput, but from what I understand. But they were a great experiment in communal living, and you eat what you produce, and they were a big attraction to young Americans who supported the state of Israel and wanted to do something tangible to evidence that support and have a nice time in a sunny place while they were away. But I finally made it down there. I took a bus that dropped me off in the middle of nowhere, and I literally was walking along a dirt road in the Gaza Strip, and another bus came along and I was schlepping a heavy Samsonite suitcase in the hot sun, and another bus came along and said, "Hey, mister, it's not a good idea to be walking alone on this road, let alone as a foreigner." So they actually took me to the kibbutz, and my roommate was surprised. He didn't know I was coming, and he hid me in his room, and they were picking farming tomatoes on this kibbutz, and I ate tomatoes 3 meals a day for the next 2 days. A lot of fun. Then the night before I was set to leave the country, which is fascinating, as anybody who's been there knows, in so many different ways fascinating. I thought I had a budget-friendly meal in a Middle Eastern restaurant and an Arab cafe in the old city of Jerusalem. And when I got back to to the hostel I was staying in. I was just deathly ill. I had violent stomach virus, and it really laid me low. I almost didn't make it to the airport the next day, but when I did, I was sweating profusely. I wasn't able to stand up straight, and probably something very obvious, set off the security people as I was about ready to go through the passport control, and I was hauled aside and put in a room and given the third degree and a very thorough search and I mean very thorough search. And finally, they let me go, and I just barely made it on the plane when the door was closing, and fell in my seat and was happy to get off in Lebanon, where I proceeded to recuperate for the next couple of days. That bug, as I'm sure others have told you, stayed with me for most of the rest of my trip, for the next month and a half, the next 6 weeks. It just kept recurring. It's a horrible thing to those who have had it. I didn't have access to medical attention that I knew of or had time to worry about. I did carry some Lomotil pills with me, which gave some relief, but I would tell any young student contemplating a circumnavigation to carry a nice full packet of antidotes to that sort of thing. Anything you can talk your doctor out of, because it might come in handy. Another thing in Cyprus, I met a trio of graduate students, women graduate students from the SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And they were on research projects also that summer. So we struck it up. They were very kind to me. They brought broth, and we were staying in the same hotel. They brought broth and bottled water to my room and made sure that I was able to make it to the plane. And I ran into them later when I was in Iran as well. We kind of palled around Isfahan, but it was always fun to meet other people who were on voyages, not only of discovery, but of research. And so, but really nothing else. I was on the wrong side of Cyprus, really for much history, but it wasn't intended to be anything more than a summer. You can't get in those days. It's difficult to get to other countries in the Middle East from Israel if you have an Israeli stamp in your passport. Nowadays, they give you a separate piece of paper, so it's not a problem. And I think they've resolved all those issues anyway. But Cyprus was neutral in the whole thing. So if I went from Israel to Cyprus and then on from Cyprus, I could go anywhere. And I was going to Iran, which wasn't a problem because it was firmly under the control of the Shah. And I had an American passport, and the U.S. had backed the Shah's regime anyway, so that wasn't a problem. But those are the little quirks of travel in the Middle East. Well, I'll tell you, it was Tehran was a massive city, but it was absolutely safe to walk through the streets at any time of day or night. And I did walk through the streets long distances, and particularly late at night when I had to get some telegrams off from the government telephone office. Very safe. The Shah not only didn't tolerate any dissent from fundamentalist Islamists, he didn't tolerate any kind of street crime or any kind of crime in general. So woe be the person who was caught assaulting a tourist, particularly an American, under his regime. I stayed at a small guest house, the owner of whom had great aspirations of coming to the United States and starting a freight forwarding business, shipping things from the Middle East, from Iran and other parts of the Middle East. I think he might have been Lebanese actually by birth, but he was living in Iran, and back and forth from the United States. And so I promised that when I get back to the States, I'd help him find some information from the government and other ways to help him along in that quest. And I don't know if he ever got here or not, but he was a very educated man, and he kind of gave me the lay of the land as far as he was willing to say in politically, economically, religiously, and otherwise in Iran. And he helped introduce me to 4 or 5 other people that I talked to as well. Iran's a fascinating place. It's just, I can't tell you how interesting it is, how beautiful it is. There are a lot of different cities with distinguished histories of their own. And it was wonderful under the under the Shah for travelers. And I understand recently that even for Americans, it's still a wonderful place to visit as long as you stick to the historical sites and don't get involved in politics, particularly politics as between the United States and Iran. Americans think it's a place you can't go to, but it's not true at all. Circumnavigator's log is full of travel logs by people who have been going there the last few years. So I went to the station agent at the airport and asked him the best way to get into the city, and he said, just hop on the crew bus with the crew from your flight. You can go in with them. So I got a kind of a nice ride into town, but when they dropped me off in the central square, it was like stepping back into the 6th century. I tell you, it was the most rudimentary, backward-looking place, even by standards of the day that I ever seen. I thought I was prepared for a lot, but it was fascinating, mind you, but it was just very, very, very old-fashioned. Women in full cotter were washing their clothes in the central fountain and taking water in buckets out of the well there. And there were great marketplaces full of glistening vats of fly-covered vats of ghee, in the hot sun of the day. And it was a marketplace of emotions and smells and scents and sights, the type of which you rarely see. So it was fascinating. Afghanistan at the time, as it had been for much of its history, was also a pond between East and West, between big countries and other big countries, or big countries and somewhat smaller countries. The time I was there, it was a pond in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, both of whom were trying to curry favor with it because of its strategic position in between the Middle East. And as a buffer. And so the Afghanis were very, very, very proud to say that they received a lot of foreign aid, both from the Russians and from the Americans. And they listened the most to the one that gave them the most money. So I took a day trip out in the country and saw dams that had been built by the Russians and power plants that had been built by the Americans. And it's kind of ludicrous in a way, but a very, very interesting place. Of course, there were no Taliban, there were no problems of that type in that epoch. And other than the fact that women were required to wear full coverage, there wasn't inequality that was obvious. I did get to see a traditional Afghan wedding from the internal balcony of veranda of the little hotel I was staying at. It was taking place down below in the courtyard of the hotel. Well, that was sort of fascinating. They even sent up some of the food for me, perched on between the railings up on the balustrade. I played ping pong with some American Jesus freaks who were there, and they, along with so many of the hippies who were flocking to Afghanistan, hippies of all stripes and colors in those days because of the easy availability of drugs. They really gave Americans as people, individuals, a bad name. So I think the Afghans were happy to see sort of normal people like me come in as tourists, even though I had sort of longish hair and I wasn't looking for drugs and other sorts of illicit things. I have a bit of problem leaving the country, however. I had bought from a dealer in central Kabul. I had bought a large chunk of beautiful lapis lazuli. It was uncut, and lapis lazuli, when it's cut and polished and made into jewelry, is a big export. And I looked for that thing today. I still have it, and but I wanted to take it out of the country and have something made of it when I got back home. So, but I didn't learn until I got to the airport that it was illegal to export uncut lapis lazuli because they wanted the value added to stay in the country, the cutting and the polishing and the forming into jewelry. So I hid this thing in the toe of a pair of boots in my Samsonite bag, and I'm telling you, when the customs guy, outbound customs guy, opened that suitcase, he was like a homing pigeon. He went right for the toe of that boot, found this big chunk of uncut lapis lazuli, and gave me a smile and called over the policeman. They were going to cuff me and take me away, but somehow I managed with sign language. They didn't speak English. I didn't speak a word of their language. And push ton or whatever they were speaking. There are a lot of languages there. And but somehow I managed to convince them. I did convince them that the stone had in a small way actually been cut, and therefore it was legal to take out of the country. They were looking for a bribe. They knew I didn't have a bribe after wearing me down for a half hour, kind of frightening the hell out of me. They knew they weren't going to get anything out of it, so they just let me go. That was that. That and the fact that you actually had to pay to get into the coffee shop at the airport there. They didn't want the masses flocking in there. Oh, my good fortune. I had the good fortune of going to a place that I'd wanted to see my whole life, like most people who have ever looked at pictures of it in the gleaming sunlight. But I happened to pick a day when A, it was cloudy and raining, and B, they were draining that fine reflecting pool in front of the Taj Mahal for cleaning. So undeterred by that, I dressed in my Gandhi khati, cotton top, and a pair of shorts, did get a picture of myself standing in the reflecting pool, under cloudy skies with the cleaners in the background swabbing it up. Went to Nepal from Delhi, and that was a very fascinating trip. I met a family of 4 Americans, a husband and wife and 2 children from Maryland, who later, when I got back much later the next year, actually invited me to their son's bar mitzvah. But they were traveling en famille across, kind of backpacking through Asia and traveling in a simple way. And we hit it off and did a lot of touring around together. But the highlight of that trip was really an all-day Land Rover trip I took on a bumpy road up through beautiful, majestic scenery all the way to the Chinese border. Americans at that time weren't allowed to go into China. I don't think any Westerners were, and it barely opened up, or wouldn't actually open up to travelers until several years later, as a matter of fact. So China was closed to tourists, but and closed to most other people if you didn't have business with the government there. So we were fascinated. When I grew up studying Mao Zedong in high school and the Cultural Revolution, we were fascinated with this figure, with his picture all over the place, and leading a country of 1 billion people that was really closed off from the outside world, much like North Korea is now, but on a much smaller scale. So we drove up to within about 150 feet of the border. You could see across the way this large picture of Mao Zedong looming over the customs shed there, but we couldn't get any closer because we didn't have business there, and photography was strictly prohibited. But as we were driving away, I did sneak my camera down through cracks in the back of the Land Rover and managed to snap a picture of that. But this is the framework of the truck, and back up the buildings up in the back of the Chinese border crossing. So I've got a little souvenir of it, and a lot of great memories. It was a fun place, very interesting place as well. Thailand at the time, along with several other countries, including Taiwan, were big R&R spots for American troops fighting in Vietnam. And so the hotels were very open and friendly to Americans of all types, and who had greenbacks. And I actually stayed in quite a nice hotel, it turns out, that was housing a number of U.S. American soldiers whom I met with, and then I proceeded to sightsee mainly in Thailand. I mean, Thailand geopolitically is always kind of kept to itself, not the subject of a lot of controversy other than its own internal politics. They can take the outside world or leave it. So there wasn't a lot of drama there that I could find. They were accepting and certainly courteous to Americans and foreigners. At least that's what they displayed outwardly. So it was an enjoyable place for me. The sightseeing, for anybody who's been there, is fabulous. The food is delicious, and the amenities are are widespread and easily accessible. I ran into that same American family of four that I'd met in Nepal again, and once again we did some sightseeing together. That was Thailand. The Singapore chapter has always been exceedingly hospitable towards grantees, starting with me. I was received with open arms by the chapter, which has always been a very active chapter. Has a good mix of membership, people from all walks of life there. They take their club membership very seriously. They have a lot of events during the year. But the important thing for me was that they opened their hospitality to me. And it started with a very nice luncheon of about 15 or 20 of them in one of the hotels where I gave a short talk. And they asked a lot of questions. And then the next day I was treated to an absolutely stunning dinner in the finest restaurant in one of the main five-star hotels there. Turns out was owned by the man who was hosting me, and he and his wife were wonderful hosts. I learned how to be gracious about eating extremely expensive shark's fin soup without sort of becoming nauseated at the time. And then the following night, I was hosted by the president of Kodak Malaya, Fred Powers, and his wife at their lovely sort of colonial style home in the northern part of the city state. And they were just the most gracious people in the world, and were so helpful to me in doing research, again, at another place that was at the crossroads of so much activity, but economic activity as well as military activity in the mid 20th century. So I enjoyed my stay there. I've encouraged every scholar that I've ever had a chance to come in contact with, encouraged them to stop off in Singapore. The Singaporeans are always gracious hosts, and in fact, I think the board should seriously consider trying to make it obligatory that if you're going to be in South Asia, you have to make time to stop off there. They genuinely appreciate it. The Singapore chapter, they like the attention showered on them by the presence of a young scholar, and it's wonderful for the scholars too, because people are very hospitable. Philippines, another one of those places like Germany, where there's a long-standing love-hate relationship with the United States due to the presence of American troops, and particularly during the Vietnam War, the huge air bases that were utilized by incoming and outgoing military personnel. But and of course, going back to the Spanish-American War, when we became their substitute colonial masters from the prior bunch, the Spaniards. But there are a lot of opinions, good and bad, in the Philippines about the U.S. I think on the whole, people appreciate the presence of the Americans there. They did at that time. A lot of discontent at the personal level in many instances, but again, because of things that had happened, usually involving American soldiers. And but I did have a chance to meet with a couple fairly substantial businessmen who kind of gave me the lay of the land and the lay of the political land there. And then I set off to try to track down one of my best friends, who was a Cuban American guy and whose father ran a big Spanish-run sugar plantation on the island of Negros Oriental. Neither he nor my friend knew I was coming. There was no way to get in touch, but I got down there, and my friend was back in the U.S. for the summer. His father and the family was away, so his father was delighted to have me to stay with him, keep him company, and be pampered by the whole guard of servants that he had on tap, do everything from polish your shoes to polish the floors in your bedroom and iron your clothes. It was wonderful. He was out in the country, and one of his good friends was a game warden, and I was privileged enough to be taken by this man up into the rainforest, and he had a fellow with him who was an expert bird caller. This guy could call every imaginable type of bird, and he liked to shoot it, but we like to photograph them. So we made this a photography trip. And a number of the planters, the cane planters nearby, hosted a big dinner party for me. And again, we're happy to have some blood from outside the island there, new blood with new stories. And it was a delightful time. You know, Hong Kong at the time, the Crown Colony, a huge British presence, and had been a huge British presence for a long time. And it was a very, Hong Kong's always fascinated me. I've been there a long time over my lifetime, and that was the first time. Been there many times, and it's always fascinated me just how adaptive it is to the East and the West. Everything in Hong Kong it revolves around commerce. It's an economic place, and even more so than Singapore. It's an economic place, and up until the events of the last few years, when the Chinese started exerting more influence and abrogating the treaty with Britain over the handover, which phased out to 2047, but the Chinese weren't honoring that, and the protests began. The Hong Kongese managed to, Hong Kongers, as they call themselves, managed to find a way to deal with the East and West with ease. And most of it, I said, revolved around commerce. Now, I went up the new territories on a train and again, looked across the border into China long before the factories were built up in Shenzhen and that whole area was settled. And a friend of mine was a teacher at the Chinese University in Shenzhen. So he opened the doors to a lot of very learned and insightful people that I could talk to about the geopolitical situation there. But the important thing that happened in Hong Kong was that I had my first custom-made clothes made, my first custom-made suits, shirts, and shoes. And I can tell you, I was the best dressed guy on campus back at Georgetown that fall semester. Now, these shoes were made at the famous and famously named, but long since defunct shoemaker of Lee Kee Shoes. And Lee Kee Shoes made wonderful shoes. Everybody wanted to have a pair of Lee Kee shoes, and that was spelled Leekee, not Leakey. But the shoes really didn't leak. They were actually very well made, and I ordered a pair, but the long production time meant that they had to ship them to me. So I had wanted them for my weekend up in New York when I had to make a presentation before the Circumnavigators Club of the findings of my trip. And those shoes arrived literally the afternoon that I was set to hop in my girlfriend's car and drive up there. So those were, I wish Leakey was still in business. Taiwan was exceedingly hospitable to Americans and extremely grateful for our longstanding support. Often the only support they had. And so Taiwan was appreciative of Americans. They opened the country up to American troops as another R&R base, and there were a lot of them there when I was there. And again, I had interesting conversations with them. It was always good to get a view from the front about the Vietnam War, because we were getting so much negativity in a general sense about the idea and the exercise of the Vietnam War, but there still were, poor Americans, most of whom probably had no desire to be there at all, who were on the front lines getting shot up and shot at. And so their point of view was always enlightening. The highlight of Taiwan was really the National Art Museum, where the Taiwanese housed that magnificent display of art from all over China that they managed to abscond with when they escaped or retreated to the island in 1949 against the communist onslaught. And it was just fantastic. And no wonder China wants to get it back. Not for its strategic importance at all. It's for all the art collection. Then I went to Japan, went back to the country that I first visited 6 years before when I was a high school student with a student group. And I spent 6 weeks there and went all over the country, from Hokkaido in the north to the southernmost islands, went on trains and bullet trains, which was fairly new at that time, and buses, and had a wonderful time. I just loved Japan. And I actually went back to one of the places, a youth center that I'd stayed at in 1965. And there was a conference of teachers of English to Japanese. They were Japanese English teachers who were there, and they were just the most wonderful group of people. And I spent the afternoon chatting them and interviewing them, and then had dinner with a fellow that I'd also been friends with, who was an older man, a businessman, and well connected politically from the earlier trip. And he put me in touch with a lot of people that I could talk to as well. So I just love Japan. I could spend a huge amount of time there, had spent a huge amount of time there. My wife spent a huge amount of time there. And I only wish I spoke Japanese. It'd make it a lot more interesting to get off the beaten path. The Japanese as a whole, at that time, were still feeling shameful about the war, but they were also feeling a little bit downtrodden by the American bombings, the horrible fire bombings that were inflicted upon civilian cities there in the final months of the war, and finally the atom bomb. But I think they'd come resigned to that, and they with that to a person, idolized MacArthur for his the fortitude he had, and the seriousness of purpose he took in rebuilding the country after the war. I mean, he was really a functional dictator to get things done, but he did get things done. They were appreciative of it because much of Tokyo had been laid low, and so many other cities, and he was determined to get the Japanese people back on their feet. They sensed that. They didn't understand why a former enemy would do that, but they were very grateful for it. And that came through in conversations with anybody over the age of 40. Went to Hiroshima, and it was a sobering place for sure. Not quite the shrine then that to travelers it was now. It held so much horror in the minds of those who lived through that whole epic. I know most Japanese and a lot of foreigners didn't want to get anywhere near the place, but it was fascinating to see what that one small steeple you see that remained from a bell tower or whatever that was, a church, I believe, or something that you always see. Yeah, it was sobering. It was sobering to me when I first saw it as a 15-year-old, and it was sobering to me when I saw it as a 21-year-old. Sort of speaks to what can go wrong when there's evil in the hearts of men from both sides. I decompressed for about 5 days in Hawaii just to soften the blow a little bit, and I can tell you that did soften the blow. A little sun and surf at Waikiki and a few Mai Tais in the evening, and it goes a long way towards getting you back down to a normal state of being. From Hawaii, I went to LA, and I stayed in the home of a friend of mine from Georgetown who was a year ahead of me in the Foreign Service School. He was of Hungarian parentage. His father was an art teacher in California at one of the universities, and he was a very bright guy. This guy was he was a good friend of mine. He was one of the most brilliant people I knew, and he really drilled me. He really drilled me on my trip, and he was an academic at heart. And he didn't want to hear the little anecdotes and the war stories that I told you tonight. He wanted to know what I found out in my research and what I was going to do with it. So that was a good way for me to coalesce my thoughts before I actually had to talk to somebody coherently about it, and much less put it down on paper a few weeks later. So that was very good. And then I stopped off at my family home in Wyoming for a week, and then I went back to school, or not even a week, a few days. And then I went back to school and started that intense and intensely satisfying. Pan-Am was an unofficial sponsor of the trip. They didn't provide any monetary coverage of it, but one of their senior vice presidents at Pan Am was a member of the Circumnavigators Club, later became a good friend, a man by the name of Larry Burchill. In fact, he signed, I noticed much, years later, he was the one who signed my wife's in-flight stewardess certificate when she graduated from Pan Am Training School. But I didn't know that at the time and didn't learn it till much later. But he was very enthusiastic about these grants. And he agreed to write a letter of good conduct on Pan Am stationery for me, which came in extremely useful in a lot of places, particularly when I had to get my 10 or 15 page ticket rewritten a number of times. They were all based on mileage and they were all handwritten. And it was a delicate process to do, but and they always cut me a little slack on the mileage when I did. And in other ways, and one of the ways that it was very useful is when I got to when I arrived in Kabul, at the airport in Kabul on Ariana Afghan Airways, I discovered that Ariana Afghan Airways was, like a lot of smaller country airlines back in the 40s and 50s, had been founded with the assistance, financial assistance, technical assistance, and then many times with the pilots and crews of Pan American World Airways. And Ariana Afghan Airlines had Pan Am livery on its side, except it just said Ariana, not Pan Am. Same color, same typeface. Headed for the airport and got on a rickety old Russian plane bound for Poland. It almost didn't take off. There was a mechanical problem with it, and there was a huge rainstorm. And after waiting for a mechanic for 2 hours and a spare part, the pilot said, "Oh, hell with it, let's go anyway." And which instilled a lot of confidence in the passengers, of course, and off we went. I had a really fascinating night ride on a train, on the night train out of Romania, out of the coastal Romania into Bulgaria. And I was in a compartment with that held 6 people. And apart from myself, there were 3 men in their nice young men in their 20s who were Palestinians. And I had a wonderful opportunity to discuss with them, and they were hostile to the U.S. from a political standpoint, but not from a personal standpoint. They liked Americans personally, but they, didn't like our politics in the Middle East conflict. But we had a good chat, a good visit, learned a lot. They were very friendly. The one who spoke excellent English was particularly engaging. But when we got to the Bulgarian border in the middle of the night, the train stopped, and some guards, three soldiers came on and handcuffed these guys in the cabin, right out of the cabin, picked them up and marched them off the train. I didn't know what was going on. I kept my mouth shut and looked forward and didn't say a word, just showed my passport. Well, the train took off again, and we went about 15 miles down the road, or it was about 15 or 20 minutes, and all of a sudden the train came to a screeching halt, and it started backing up. Now this was a part of the Orient Express backing up on the rails for 15 or 20 minutes, and we stopped back at the border crossing, and these 3 guys came back on the train, beaming from ear to ear. They sat down without saying a word. Once the train safely left the station again, and we were in Bulgaria, I turned to one guy and I said, "What's going on with you guys?" And he reached down into the armrest of the seat between the 2 of us, pried it open, and inside it was stuffed with gold and dollar bills. These guys were smugglers. They were very amiable smugglers, but they got away with it. That's my night train ride from Romania to Bulgaria. In Amritsar, I was on a supposedly nonstop Indian Airlines flight from Kabul to Delhi. But this plane made an unscheduled stop in Lahore first off, and then in Amritsar across the border. And we were told to get off and look for our luggage in this little shed that they call an airport. And so I went to the agent. I said, "What's going on? We're supposed to be going to Delhi. Was there another flight leaving to Delhi? This was a nonstop flight." He looked at me with a blank stare and said, "End of the line. This is the end of the line." I said, "Well, Delhi's 300 miles away. How do you expect us to get there?" "Not my problem." And so there were a couple of other Americans on this plane, and they happened to have been curators from the American Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so the three of us sort of teamed up on this agent. We said, listen, here's the tickets. It says you have to get us to New Delhi. So if you can't do that by air, you've got to get us there somewhere. You just have to. And so he said, okay, stand by, I'll find transportation. And we stood by, and our transportation turned out to be a very, very old and decrepit, what was the name of it? Hindustani ambassador car from about the 1960, I believe. It was old and beat up, driven by a congenial Sikh wearing a bright pink turban. And he was going to drive us on the back roads down to the only roads down to Delhi. He had never been there. Didn't have a clue how to get there, but he knew there was only one road. And so before we set off, but before we left town, before we left Amritsar, he drove us by the golden, whatever it's, the Golden Temple. And then he proceeded to drive to the outskirts to a very modest little dwelling that he shared with his wife to say goodbye to her, because she would have no idea why he wasn't coming home from his work at the airport. And we set out on a 12-hour harrowing drive in the middle of the night, or in the middle of the night later, down to Delhi. And I'm telling you, it was an adventure. My job, I was sitting in the front seat, two of them were in the back drinking whiskey out of a flask. And my job was holding my foot over a hole this big of a hole in the firewall of the car, because the heat from the engine was pouring right into my face. It was already about 110 degrees in the car. And I did that the whole way. The driver, for his part, spent one hand on the driving wheel, dodging every sort of obstruction that was happening in the roadway going down to Delhi, and with the other hand, shorting out the horn with two pieces of wire with his left hand. And he blew that horn all the time. Everybody blew their horns all the time. I'll tell you, that road, that two-lane road, was covered with every type of vehicle, powered and unpowered, known to man. They were all blowing their horns if they had them. It was covered with pedestrians. And by the way, all the vehicles didn't turn their lights on at night because they thought they could save fuel by not using their lights. So they were all running in the dark. There were human pedestrians, there were cows, there were dogs, there were every manner of animal. And it went on, and we had a flat tire in the middle of the night in some out of the way place. It was all kind of out of the way. And they found a guy who fixed it. It took about an hour to do that. It was something right. It was something right out of a Fellini movie. I just wish I would have had a video camera and been able to capture it. We rolled into Old Delhi in the middle of the night and saw the tens of thousands of people who were born, live their lives, and die on the streets. And they were sleeping there, sound asleep under their pieces of cardboard. We rolled up in front of the Oberoi Intercontinental Hotel, and that's the only time in that whole trip that I actually spent more than $5 a night for hotel lodging. I was exhausted, beat, and I needed little TLCs. You know, I didn't know what to expect, and nobody really could tell me. Ray Dinsmore was going to be out of the country that weekend, so he graciously lent me his apartment to stay at, myself and my girlfriend, who was invited. But nobody knew what to expect. Nobody really gave me any guidance as what they wanted to hear or anything like that. I only knew from my dealings with in my interviews and that sort of thing, that and the personalities of the people who did them, was that you're not going to get. I wasn't going to have much of the attention span of people at a formal, ball dinner party, much beyond 20 minutes, and I wasn't going to have much of attention span if I kept the thing academic or in any way pondersome. So somebody gave me good advice when I got to the Plaza Hotel, and that was, I think it was J. Art Mahoney, who was sitting in for Ray as the host of the evening. And J. Art took me aside and said, "Listen, Greg, just tell them stories. Just tell them stories." Well, I guess at a very basic level, my first conclusion was the premise I set out to examine, and that is, don't believe everything you read in the press about other countries' attitudes and other people's in those countries' attitudes towards the U.S., particularly when the political climate is charged. I found that people's attitudes were a lot more nuanced and complex influenced by many other things than met the eye to Americans here at home, listening to them on the news reports about foreign countries and about go home Yankee all over the world. As with attitudes everywhere, a lot depends on whose ox is being gored, I learned. And most of the people I met had very little understanding of US policy, foreign policy, or even knew what foreign policy was, but they had very definite attitudes about the United States. And those attitudes were shaped by a lot of things. Some of them were shaped by their memory of the US's involvement in reconstructing Europe, liberating Europe and reconstructing Europe and Japan after the war. Some of them, some of their attitudes had to do with something as superficial as either a love for and abhorrence of American pop culture. Others were aspirational in nature, such as a desire to live the American dream in their own country or not. And some were driven by mean-spiritedness and envy, such as, why can't America mind its own business? Some were driven by national pride or arrogancy. The French, for example, what can America possibly teach us? I didn't go to France for that reason. I didn't think I'd learn much. Some were driven by personal friendships or other interactions with Americans, and some were well and truly determined by a close analysis of American foreign policy and criticisms of it or liking of it. So it was a complex set of things I found that determined people's attitudes, and it wasn't as simple as yes and no. When I was doing my trip, World War II, the end of World War II was really only 25 years in the past, which is, when you think about 25 years from the current time, that's 1996. You were a living, breathing, thinking person yourself. So that amount of time passes in a heartbeat. But and that meant that a lot of the people who had been through the war were still alive. They weren't old. They weren't in their dotage. They were of an age when they very, very carefully and vividly recalled the war years. And a lot of them, I remember, even in out of the way places you couldn't imagine, remembered the kindness of an American soldier, or providing them shoes or food, or rebuilding a city. And so that personal approach and whole thought process by people who were looking back in time at their relationship with America was extremely enlightening to me, because like a lot of people, I was just thinking about the memory bank of the current generation of people. So that was an important factor in people's attitudes at the time. As you no doubt recall from your senior year in college, it's tremendously busy. Mine was incredibly busy because in addition to carrying a full workload, and I was taking a full triple major in history, government, and economics, and minor in Spanish. I took a graduate seminar in international law, which I was admitted to, which was an excellent course. I joined the Middle East Institute as a student member and went to a lot of lectures and attended seminars there. I met with prospective applicants for the Circumnavigators Fellowship and gave a few information sessions to people who were interested to be the number 2 on that trip. I continued to work on a massive survey of 50 years of SFS alumni, which was under the auspices of Professor Giles, who was one of my favorite professors. I made the rounds of embassy cocktail parties, which the dean's office had arranged. I was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. I studied for and passed the written and oral foreign service exams, and applied to law schools, interviewed for international jobs, and was a resident assistant in a freshman dorm, which took a lot of time, and where one of my charges was the son of the Shah of Iran's Minister of Protocol. A little bit of international influence close at home there. I was a busy boy. Yeah, having gone on my trip and received the grant, gone on my trip, that experience provided me with a lot of interesting things to talk about in application essays and in interviews. I had a lot of war stories to tell. And having been awarded a highly competitive fellowship of this type was a definite resume booster. That's about all I can say. It was plus plus. After I left the Foreign Service School, where I attained a degree, Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service, I worked for 5 years for an international trading company. And then I attended Harvard Business School, where I got an MBA in 1979 with high distinction, and I studied general management. My career actually began when I left the SFS. I passed the Foreign Service exam and had been put on an 18-month hold for hiring with replacement with the State Department. They had hiring freeze and were only hiring due to attrition. So until a spot came up for a junior Foreign Service officer, in my particular cone was the economic cone, they weren't offering you a position. So they said, we'll put you on hold for 18 months. If something comes up, we'll make you an offer. If it doesn't, then you have to go through the whole process again. So I had planned to go to law school, and was admitted to Georgetown Law School at that point. And I said to myself, what happens if I'm a year into law school, having shelled out hard-earned bucks from my pocket, and I get called up by the State Department? That doesn't make sense. Maybe the best thing to do is look for a job instead. So belatedly, I went to the placement office of Georgetown Foreign Service School, and they set up some interviews for me. And lo and behold, I was offered a position with an international export management company with offices all around the world. And they basically acted as the export arm for mid-sized American manufacturers in foreign countries. Since I spoke Spanish, I went to Venezuela, and I lived in Caracas for 3 years and covered Central America as well as the Caribbean and Venezuela. And after that, was given the opportunity to take over their operation in Australasia, based in Sydney, Australia. So I spent 5 years in international trade. And during the early part of that course of which I was called up by the State Department and was offered a position in some country I can't even recall. It was certainly not a plum assignment. But by that time, to tell you the truth, I was enjoying my job in the private sector. I had come in contact with a lot of the American consulates and embassies abroad. And I just couldn't understand how some of the people who worked there had taken the same exam that I did. I hate to be arrogant about it, because they're tremendously good people in the Foreign Service. But I had decided that my lifelong dream of being a diplomat was overshadowed by my desire to make some money and for the excitement of the private sector. So that's why I stayed. So then, after 5 years there, I went back and took up a deferred admission to Harvard Business School, and 2 years later switched focus from international trade to international financial activities. And I initially worked as a new ventures assistant to an industrialist and ship owner based in New York. He had interests all over the world and was a fascinating guy to learn and work for. Then I went into private equity investing for a number of years, and then was hired by an investment bank, an English investment bank, and that was later acquired by a major U.S. investment bank. And I spent the rest of my career doing the international mergers and acquisitions and advisory business all over the world. The latter part of it, the last 4 or 5 years, was involved in managing, advising on some of the major privatizations from all over the world. Government selling off their stake in major industries, telephone companies, sewers, and waterworks, and that sort of thing, roads and bridges. And that took me to Asia, to Latin America, a huge amount, and to Europe. It was a wonderful career. It came to an end, as all careers do, and became a younger man's game. And I semi-retired and met with a semi-retired good friend of mine who had been a management consultant, and we set up an advisory firm here in our hometown of Greenwich, and ran that for a few years. And then he went to Florida, and I tossed in the top towel, and that was it. It was a international career, internationally based in every sense of the word, for my entire time in it, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I certainly learned to be more patient. Things don't always go as smoothly as they're planned, particularly when the communications are very difficult, both linguistically and the fact that just try to imagine yourself traveling back around the world in the days when there weren't iPhones, there weren't cellular phones of any kind, there wasn't any type of instant communication. The only way you could communicate with home was by telex, which is expensive, or by an overseas phone call, which is even more expensive. So they were few and far between. The way I communicated was basically through written letters dropped off at the American Express offices all over the world, where people like me looked for their mail and got reassurance from somebody that at least worked for a company that had an American name. So I learned to be patient. I learned much more than I already knew, to try to anticipate, to just look down the road and anticipate what could crop up, what problems and shortcomings could occur, and anticipate them. And I learned to trust my instincts, because my instincts often served me well. They served me well, for example, when I picked the topic I did for the research proposal. But I guess the other thing I learned is I learned to be less trusting and more cautious of strangers. People around the world, basically, in my view, are good at heart and well-intentioned, but they can also be avaricious. As far as aspirations, the trip strengthened my lifelong desire to have an international career. That's simple. It sort of rounded out a lot of my academic training. It put a lot of the things I've learned in a very real perspective, a very close and meaningful perspective. And it just convinced me what I've already was convinced of, and that was I wanted to work in the international sphere. I was excited to become a circumnavigator, and I was made a circumnavigator. And I made a lot of friends instantly with some of the older circumnavigators who had been on the selection committee to choose me, including the president of the club, who at that time was Charlie Blaisdell, and the president of the foundation, who was Ray Dinsmore. And it's under his wing. He let me stay at his apartment in New York the night before I left on my trip. He insisted I did, and filled me full of good advice, including always carry a wad of $100 bills in singles when you're abroad, because they come in very handy where you can't get change and you need to make a tip or take a taxi or what have you. And he insisted on riding with me in the Cary bus out to the airport. The Cary bus was an airport bus that used to leave from the East Side Air Terminal, New York City, and we walked down from his apartment near the UN. He took me out to the airport and waited till I boarded the plane and to leave on my trip. And after that, he opened his apartment to me whenever I was in New York. He let my girlfriend and me stay in his apartment when I was in New York for the weekend of my presentation to the circumnavigators. He was absent, unfortunately, but he was just a very tremendously hospitable guy. He was a good friend of my wife, Kathy. They became fast friends, and she was a Pan Am flight attendant at the time and a graduate student at Columbia University in international education. And they had a huge amount of camaraderie. And she used to go to his apartment as he started losing his eyesight and wash his hair and get him all spiffed and polished for circumnavigators events that she would then take him to. He came out to Cincinnati after we left New York and after my daughter was born to greet her. He was just a very, very, very warm and welcoming person, and always was a soundboard for me in everything I did. I never made a move with anything that had to do with my career or really with my life without consulting him first. A number of them, I kept in touch with Ray and I received the publications and did what I could from abroad to send correspondence to them. Later on, when I was back in New York working after business school, I became treasurer of the foundation in 1979 or 80 for a couple of years. And that was really my first official position with the organization. And since that time, I've served as a director of the foundation, a vice president of the foundation, president of the foundation from to 98, and from 2003 to the current time. I served a couple of terms on the board of the governors of the Circumnavigators Club, which I enjoyed tremendously. But most of my activities are centered around the foundation. I chaired probably 10 grant selection committees for the New York Metropolitan grant that we established in the early 2000s, and traveled with Ray Dinsmore to Michigan and other places to sit on committees as well. So I've seen a lot. You know, personally, it's been a tremendous source of pride to me. My whole involvement with the foundation, with the club itself, it really is a source of pride for me, and it's been very useful as well. I think in my international business activities, the lessons that my trip taught me of greater flexibility and greater patience, in fact, fast talking my way out of difficult spots, came in very handy. They all paid off. So there were some life lessons to be learned.